our lives for better or worse. For more than half a century in the days before television, it was the motion picture newsreel, seen in thousands of theaters throughout the world, which presented their faces and voices to a weekly audience estimated at more than 200 million people. In the film which follows, you will see a few of the people who have influenced our destinies, inspired our ideals. Principal players upon a stage which newsreel cameras photographed for more than 50 years. Eyewitness to history. No single individual was more admired at the turn of the 20th century than Thomas Edison, the world's greatest inventor, photographed here by the very motion picture camera system which he and his associates had invented in the 1890s. His invention of this and other useful devices, such as the electric light and the phonograph, earned him the title the Wizard of Menlo Park and a permanent place in the annals of scientific and engineering achievement. It was the camera which Edison and his successors developed which allowed for the permanent recording in motion picture images of the notable men and women who followed him. Theodore Roosevelt, robust 26th President of the United States. Woodrow Wilson, who tried to keep us out of the First World War, but who finally signed the Declaration which put millions of American soldiers into the trenches of Europe. The decade of the 1920s which followed was prosperous but hectic. President Calvin Coolidge, staid and conservative New Englander, had a personal style which made him seem anachronistically old-fashioned in a decade remembered as the Jazz Age and the Roaring Twenties. Coolidge had inherited an act of Congress which prohibited the sale and consumption of alcohol. It was a law which never worked despite government attempts to enforce it. In 1927, America acquired a hero of enormous proportions, Charles Augustus Lindbergh, the first human being to fly across the Atlantic Ocean solo, non-stop, seen here in his triumphant return to the United States from France. Courageous, modest, shy, and unassuming, Lindbergh was a perfect hero. He was admired extravagantly throughout the world, and when he came to Washington to accept a medal from President Coolidge, hundreds of thousands turned out to see him. 2 years later, in 1929, the crash of the American Stock Exchange plunged the country into a profound depression. Multimillionaire John D. Rockefeller hardly noticed it, but for most Americans, the decade that followed was one of grinding poverty. Most celebrated of scientists during this decade was Albert Einstein, seen here arriving by passenger ship from Europe. Einstein had developed a general theory of relativity which challenged ideas in the field of physics, which had been held for centuries. Some of his theories later led indirectly to the development of the atomic bomb. Another celebrity, the famous author George Bernard Shaw.
It's no good in this country putting questions of national importance to me. I've been here before. I told you what to do and you haven't done it. And you're up to your neck in trouble.
The years of the 1930s were troubled, violent ones for America. Economic distress and unemployment were widespread. Strikes, disorders, and riots were common. Citizen against citizen, capital against labor. Tragedy for Charles Lindbergh in 1932. The hero's child was kidnapped from his home, a ransom demanded. On the night of March 1st, 1932, an abductor climbed to the second story of the Lindbergh home, stole the infant from its crib, and escaped with it. Ransom negotiations followed. Thousands of dollars were paid. Unknown to the parents, the child was already dead. 2 years later, a German ex-convict named Bruno Richard Hauptmann was arrested for the crime. Incriminating circumstantial evidence was found on his property, including substantial amounts of the Lindbergh ransom money. Hauptmann was taken to Flemington, New Jersey, where he stood trial for kidnapping and murder. It was the trial of the century, and the press turned it into a circus. For one of the few times in legal history, newsreel cameras were allowed in the courtroom as prosecutor David Willents questioned the defendant.
Didn't you swear on truth to the courthouse? Didn't you lie on the oath? Time and time again, didn't you? I did not. You did not? No. All right. When you were arrested with this Lindbergh ransom money, you had a $20 bill. Lindbergh ransom money, did they ask you what about it?
Hauptmann was found guilty, sentenced to death, and removed to Trenton State Prison, where on April 3rd, 1936, he was executed.
You tell the truth. I said nothing, fool. You lied, didn't you? I did, yes.
In 1933, Alcatraz, a maximum security prison, was opened for business, located on Pelican Island in San Francisco Bay. To it were brought the country's most dangerous and incorrigible criminals, many to spend the rest of their lives there, some to be executed. Not a single convict is known to have escaped from Alcatraz. Most famous inmate Al Capone, boss of the Chicago rackets, who finished his life there. After Capone, public enemy number one was John Dillinger, a vicious thug who terrorized the Midwest during the 1930s with his robbing and killing. Captured briefly, Dillinger escaped. He eluded scores of lawmen for months, until one summer's night in July of 1934, J. Edgar Hoover's FBI agents caught up with him outside a Chicago movie theater and shot him to death. Public enemy number one was laid to rest shortly thereafter, his funeral attended by thousands of curious but grateful citizens. About the only person who ever spoke well of him was his father.
John could be exonerated from this crime and come back home. I think he'd make a good citizen or a good officer of some kind.
Americans had something to celebrate in 1933, the end of Prohibition, the end of more than 10 years of legal and political hypocrisy. No longer did the buying and drinking of liquor have to be hidden in illegal speakeasies and roadhouses. A happy America celebrated. This fellow's not a boxer, he's a baseball player. Babe Ruth, working out in the gym, keeping in shape for another season with the New York Yankees. For more than 10 years, Ruth was baseball's greatest star, the home run king, the Sultan of SWAT, who hit 714 home runs during his career, the all-time record until the coming of Hank Aaron years later. In boxing, by 1937, James J. Braddock had become heavyweight champion of the world and was preparing to defend his crown against an up-and-coming challenger, Joe Louis. Louis won and went on to become, in his time, boxing's greatest star, winning 24 fights and retaining his title for 12 years, finally retiring from the ring undefeated. Louis's victory in 1937 triggered joyous celebrations in Harlem and elsewhere, the first black heavyweight champion of the world since Jack Johnson in 1915. The President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, throws out the first baseball of the season. Baseball remained America's favorite spectator sport throughout the 1930s. Everybody attended if they could, and if the newsreel cameramen looked carefully enough, they found many of America's most celebrated people to photograph. Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, 32nd President and First Lady of the United States. Former President Herbert Hoover, the man he defeated. Boxing champion Jack Dempsey. And New York's colorful mayor, Jimmy Walker. Prominent in the 1930s was Eleanor Roosevelt. Unlike many previous presidents' wives who had lived in the shadow of their husbands, she was immensely visible as an author, world traveler, social and political activist, and feminist leader of her day.
We have seen the American motion picture become foremost in all the world. The motion picture industry has utilized its vast resources of talent and facilities, in a sincere effort to help the people of the hemisphere to come to know each other. Dictators, those who enforce the totalitarian form of government, think it's a dangerous thing for their unfortunate peoples to know that in our democracy, officers of the government are the servants and never the masters of the people.
On December 7, 1941, the totalitarian forces of the Empire of Japan attacked the United States without warning at Pearl Harbor. On December 11th, Germany and Italy also declared war on the United States. World War II had begun.
I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Winston Churchill, leader of Great Britain, America's closest ally, traveled to America and addressed the Congress of the United States. In this excerpt, he refers to the execution of captured American airmen by Japanese authorities.
The cold-blooded execution of United States airmen by the Japanese government is a proof not only of their barbarism, but of the dread with which they regard this possibility. It is the duty of those who are charged with the direction of the war to overcome at the earliest moment the military, geographical, and political difficulties and begin the process, so necessary and desirable, of laying the cities and other munition centers of Japan in ashes, for in ashes they must surely lie before peace comes back to the world.
The war took 6 long years to win before the totalitarian governments of Germany, Italy, and Japan could be crushed. Never since have Americans agreed so closely, seen so clearly the ends to which war would lead them. Along the way, there were lighter moments to remember. Before a newspaper strike could be settled, New York's popular ebullient mayor, Fiorello LaGuardia, read the Dick Tracy comic strips to children over the city's radio station.
Here is Wash. Doors of the laundry wagon are open. He's leaning with his back toward those wagons, and he's counting his money. 2, 3, 4,000. Now he's getting into the hundreds. 600, 700, 800, and the picture shows a hand of Breathless stretching out. She's got hold of that iron pot. Remember the iron pot she took from the Van Hoosen's gardener's flat to put the money in. And crash! She crashes it on his head. Knocked out.
The Second World War was nearly over when suddenly, without warning, Franklin Roosevelt was dead.
Harry S. Truman was sworn in as President of the United States just 4 hours after a massive cerebral hemorrhage had ended the life of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Chief Justice Harlan Stone administered the oath of office. Throughout America and our far-flung military encampments, flags flew at half-mast for the fallen leader. The funeral procession moved slowly through the streets of the stunned and saddened capital. People wept openly along its course. Mr. Roosevelt had appeared drawn and weary upon his return from the Yalta Conference 6 weeks earlier, but no one had any premonition that death was so imminent. Few presidents have been so well loved by the masses of people, or so well hated by some groups. From the time he took office in 1933, in the depths of the Depression, he fought for the rights and the security of the oppressed.
Germany surrendered in May of 1945. President Truman ordered atomic bombs dropped upon Japan. 80,000 people died in the city of Hiroshima alone, and many more in Nagasaki. A grim introduction to the atomic age and a military reality with which the people of every nation would now have to live.
Crowds gather in front of the White House, awaiting the announcement of Japan's surrender from President Harry S. Truman. It took 2 atomic bombs to bring Japan to her knees. But now Pearl Harbor was avenged, and the news triggered the greatest celebration the nation has ever known. The greatest, wildest celebration of them all was in New York's Times Square. Never before or since has there been a crowd like this on the Great White Way. 2 million people screamed their elation at the end of the most devastating war in recorded history. For 24 hours, the celebration went on, and not for a minute did it lag. Victory had come. Old Glory waved over a happy land.
The Emperor of Japan, now stripped of his divinity, visits the crushed city of Hiroshima. The world prays for peace, but within 5 years, the Korean War has broken out. General Douglas MacArthur, conqueror of Japan, leads United Nations forces in the war, is then removed from office by President Truman in a dispute over civilian and military authority. In a memorable address to the Congress, MacArthur ends his military career and bids farewell to his country.
address you with neither rancor nor bitterness. In the fading twilight of life, with but one purpose in mind, to serve my country. For that reason, I have strongly recommended in the past, as a matter of military urgency, that under no circumstances must Formosa fall under communist control.
Americans paused briefly to honor the only remaining members of those men who had fought in our Civil War of 1861, sole survivors of the Grand Army of the Republic, America's only living link with that monumental war between the states. By the late 1950s, a Cold War between the United States and its former ally, the Soviet Union, was well developed. American airplane pilot Francis Powers is shot down over Russian territory in 1960 while gathering intelligence data for the United States in a U-2 airplane. In a sideshow performance, the Soviet Union tries and convicts him as a spy. Russian Premier Khrushchev breaks off talks in Paris with President Dwight Eisenhower. At a White House press conference, the president comments upon the Powers spy case and America's intelligence activities, arguing for a mutually acceptable open skies policy between the two countries.
Open society, in the day of present weapons, are the only answer. This was the reason for my open skies proposal in 1955, which I was ready instantly to put into effect, to permit aerial observation over the United States and the Soviet Union, which would assure that no surprise attack was being prepared against anyone. I shall bring up the open skies proposal again at Paris. It is a means of ending concealment and suspicion.
A new face and a new lifestyle come to the White House in 1961 as John Kennedy takes the oath of office. The new chief executive and his first lady are young, attractive, articulate celebrities in their own right. Nowhere is the influence of international celebrities upon lifestyles, politics, fashion, and economics in the 20th century more apparent than in the growing, prosperous entertainment industries.
Tonight, the best efforts in motion picture production are rewarded. The tension mounts as Greer Garson announces the best actor.
And the winner is Burt Lancaster.
Burt Lancaster played a convincing creature in Sinclair Lewis's Elmer Gantry, a demanding role. Well done.
Elizabeth Taylor.
Convalescing from her recent grave illness, Elizabeth Taylor receives a prolonged accolade from the audience. It's a popular choice. An Oscar for the beauty who is a winner after 4 successive tries. Audrey Hepburn on the year's Best Picture.
The Apartment, Billy Wilder.
Billy Wilder accepts as producer. And Gala Knight for film then.
In England, Andrew is born to Queen Elizabeth and the Duke of Edinburgh. In Japan, Akihito, heir to the Japanese throne, has a son. And in the United States, Americans delight in the birth of a child to President and Mrs. Kennedy. Soon thereafter, the president and the nation face a grave threat in Cuba.
Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
A confrontation of major proportions follows between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Soviets have provided nuclear missiles to Fidel Castro, dictator of Cuba, seen here at the United Nations. The U.S. imposes a so-called quarantine of Cuba. The Soviet Union backs down and removes its missiles. A military catastrophe is narrowly averted. In November of 1963, the life of the popular president comes to a tragic end when John Fitzgerald Kennedy, 35th President of the United States, is cut down by an assassin's bullet. Citizens throughout the country are shocked, and the whole world mourns his death. There is a minute of silence at the United Nations. Lyndon B. Johnson becomes the 36th President of the United States. As the 20th century moves toward its conclusion, powerful men make their appearance, rule briefly, and then pass one by one from the stage of history. Theirs was the rule of political and military power. Other people ruled our lives with laughter, song, and entertainment. A new generation of show business celebrities makes its appearance and its impact upon international lifestyles. In the United States, Elvis Presley, the king of popular music, marries Priscilla Ann. In his time, Presley exerts a major influence on popular music, the first modern singer to successfully blend soul, rock, and country western music. No group of musical performers are more influential than the Beatles, who arrive in the United States in the 1960s from England. Beatlemania takes the country by storm, exercises an important influence upon popular music and the fashions of a new generation of young people. In 1967, the era of the theatrical motion picture draws to a close, supplanted by television newscasts, a powerful new medium for the dissemination of fashion, culture, politics, and information.